Kallan lay listening to her own breath, wheezed within her chest somewhere beyond the world painted black. Spring can sing across the sea. Kallan breathed and dropped her head to the side. The light was dim and orange, Kallan mused, and far away. She shifted her glossy gaze to Nordri. By the fire he sat, watching, eagerly, waiting for the moment when Ori would walk away. Ori never walked away, not since the night he had found him chanting his rhyme. Occasionally a verse or two of the dreadful ditty carried to the caves to awake Kallan or lull her to sleep. Always Nordri stared. Kallan rolled her head away and peered up at the black ceiling. She no longer noticed the bitter tang, or the weight of the elding chains, or the endless fire that scorched her broken ribs. She was too broken to feel any more. Deep, thick scabs formed where she lay on the stone the most, and she was always thirsty. "Forever thirsty," she said. Kallan watched a drip of water desperately cling to a stalactite overhead. Her parched lips, swollen, cracked and bleeding, left her face numb to the beatings Jurin and Blaine eagerly provided. Only after her sense shut down to preserve her sanity, after she surrendered all likelihood of survival, did the Devagar beat the last of the hope from Kallan. The voices behind the haze were silent. Eventually they too abandoned Kallan despite their best efforts. The haze of silver, blue, and white clouded Kallan's mind. There shapes waxed and waned as they came and went, spilling through the empty, endless room of smooth silver stone. There, behind the iron wall, images of forgotten memories and ancient voices stirred. It was there Kallan went when she slept, when she slipped into the shadows to hide. Here, no pain could reach her. Here, Devagar eyes couldn't find her. The haze billowed as Kallan moved with ease through the mist. Distorted shadows of forgotten faces peered from a distance where they were the most obscure. Their voices carried through the silver blue like an endless echo, repeating words they once entered long ago. Like eternal darkness into the endless moonlight, the haze stretched on. Aimlessly, Kallan wandered wherever the impulse drove her. She passed many hours like this. Never looking back, she roamed the great void behind her iron-clad wall, drifting about, desperate to lose herself in the haze. "For if I were to lose my way," Kallan reasoned, "perhaps I should not return at all to the other side of dreaming." It was like this, roaming about as it pleased her, that a glint of silver caught her eye in the shadows ahead, where the mist was thinnest. Curious, Kallan glided toward the pale silver light that glistened through the ice-blue white. Through the mist, Kallan slipped over the cold, polished floors, following the gray figure in the distant shadow. What began as an ambiguous shade became a woman, standing alone in a beam of pale moonlight where the haze diminished. Solitary and alone she stood. A lilac gown hugged her form and flowed to her feet without a blemish or ornament to distract from the subject. Her hair hung in long russet ringlets, as dark as clove flowers, past her waist. Simple elegance encompassed the woman, whose high cheekbones and slender figure matched Kallan's perfectly. All but the eyes. Almond eyes with bright rings of gold and closed black pupils. Hot and fallen tears burned Kallan's eyes and clamped her throat closed. The end of her smashed nose burned, and she lowered her gaze to the woman's left hand. Black characters encircled the base of the woman's index finger in a ring of ogham runes. The lines and dashes flowed like webbing down the back of her hand, to and around a tricorner knot intertwined with a circle. Like a climbing vine, it wove runes around her wrist until an intricate black bracelet, etched in ancient letterings, had formed. Kira gave Kallan a soft smile, displaying her perfect pale face. With burning cheeks, Kallan dropped her eyes to her own bare feet, maimed and calloused from the cave floor. She scrutinized the shredded remnants of a chemise. "Here she stands," Kallan whispered. "Lorlenalin's queen, Darkafa and daughter of Ale. Here in my glory, my filth and rags." "Kallan," her mother's voice, so soft, so clear, as she had heard it long ago, lanced her, choking the breath from her, and only then did Kallan realize she had spoken aloud. Despite the cuts and bruising, her tangled hair matted with filth from the caves, her blood and vomit, the red, black, and broken limbs that made up her body, Kallan raised her eyes to her mother. And Kira smiled. They stared at one another, neither speaking for a long time, as Kira studied the woman her child had become, and Kallan relearned every strand of hair, every curve, and every movement her mother made. After a while, Kira furrowed her brow. "Where is the pendant?" she asked, without a hint of reprimand. The question weighted Kallan's chest. "I lost it," Kallan said, lowering her eyes, and every bit of Kallan ached to fall through the mist and hug her. Her mother's golden eyes were as sharp as ever, though it had never been any other way. "And the hunter?" Kira asked, adamant and sincere. Kallan's shoulders slumped lower. Twice she would disappoint her mother within a single breath. "I lost him too," Kallan said, and looked at her feet. A tuft of wind blew, spinning a bit of the haze into a mini tornado at her mangled feet. "Where is it?" The deep amber voice rolled over Kallan like warm, sweet sap, and Kallan looked back to her mother. But all that remained was the pale moonlight beating down at the empty silver blue shimmering in the mist. Behind the haze, Ori sat on a slope of flowstone that had poured and hardened from the stalagmite that fastened her chains. He sported his usual leather overcoat and casually, comfortably resting an arm loosely on one knee. He stayed in the shadows, seemingly indifferent to her appearance. "My mother's gone," she said, forcing the words from her throat. If Ori was put off, he didn't show it. Kallan lay where they had dumped her on the floor of the cave, believing she still stood in the haze. "This will all end if you give them the pouch," Ori said. Kallan cocked her head, unsure if pity clung to his words. An audible grunt of disbelief escaped her throat. It sounded too much like Gudrun, and she made a mental note never to do it again. "I don't believe that," she said, "and I'd be the greater fool for thinking it." "You look like you don't believe anyone." He didn't move, but sat quietly, as if waiting for an opportunity to come. "I shouldn't," Kallan said, and looked back to the pale moonlight. The disappointment was visible on her face. From the corner of her eye, Ori stood from his seat on the flowstone. Having learned to associate any movement with pain, she twitched and Ori froze, allowing her security in his distance. "You don't trust me, do you?" Ori asked. His large figure in the shadow loomed where the last of the mist swirled and diminished around his boots. She met his black round eyes, unable to see past the smooth pale skin and black beard. "You're one of them," she said. "You're the same." It was the first time he showed any emotion, and the cold, hard, calculative stare vanished. Ori held Kallan's gaze for a long time. She pondered the whys and wherefores of his visit, and cursed herself for not seeing it sooner. "Why are you here?" Kallan asked, irate that she hadn't asked this first. Ori shrugged, closing his eyes briefly as he did so. It stirred a distant memory behind her wall. "We collect trinkets." "Lie," she said, suddenly aware that she'd been slurring through the entire conversation, and immediately made the effort to stop. Ori studied Kallan's sighs. "It doesn't suit you." "Lie again." Kallan spoke more boldly. The haze was clearing. "No." Ori shook his head and pointed to the shackles she had forgotten were there. At once her wrists were heavy again. "The chains," he said. "They don't suit you." "Don't you have someone else's dreams to invade?" Kallan asked, growing more irritated with his presence. "You think this is a dream?" "I know it is," she said. Anger was flooding back as energy surged through her. It engulfed her as it had taken in a long, deep breath of fresh air. On suspicion alone, she reached her consciousness down to her core, and like the dragons of lore, the scythe sparked to life. "Why are you here?" she whispered, realizing he had evaded her question. Her voice was strong, though raw from disuse. A grin was his answer, a kind grin that stretched the face beneath his beard. "You haven't changed at all, Kallan," he said with a deep sigh. "And you were right." He pointed to the chains and solemnly added before walking away, "Sometimes the dragons are real." "Kallan," a voice called through the mist, somewhere behind her iron wall. "The dragons are real!" It came from far away. The high, soft twitters of a girlish giggle mingled with forgotten squeals and laughter. "There he is, Ori! There's the dragon is!" "Ori!" Kallan whispered as the voices faded with the haze. One last time Ori gazed at the elding chains. The 2 links that trailed from Kali's wrists were free from the single run. "Ori," Kallan whispered. The bowl that burned with a bitter tang lay upturned on the floor. In the darkest corner, at the root of despair, a fire erupted to life. Long abandoned hope awakened, flooding Kallan with a bloodlust only de Vergar blood could sate. Ori, Nodri, Durin, Blaine, and Monsignor. If she was going to make a run for it, they would all have to be down, and once she started running, she would not be able to stop, not for a while at least. Kallan stood on shaking legs, reminding her that the drug was still clearing her system. She collected the chains in her hand and charged for Ori. Swinging the links down, she smashed them into the back of his head. He was down before he had time to study the room. Vindictiveness in its rarest form exploded to life as Kallan located Nodri, who sat by the fire alone. She imagined that sick smile of his and fired a double shot of pent-up scythe from both palms. He fell before he had time to reach for his axe. Not bothering to watch Nodri fall, Kallan ran in a direction she guessed would take her to the mouth of the cave, already pulling the next ball of scythe in both palms as Blaine came at her with his axe, but her inhibitions were gone. Lunging ahead, Kallan threw herself toward Blaine, stopping so close they could have touched. Before his axe came down, Kallan grabbed his face with her left hand, his chest with her right, and fired her scythe through him. The blast propelled his body back. He was dead before he hit the wall behind him. With the mouth of the cave in sight, Kallan collected her next round of scythe and grabbed the chains at her wrists. So close to the end, Kallan sprinted, battling back the urge to vomit. With every step, pain gored her gut. Fire ate her legs and burned her chest. From the mouth of the cave, Durin emerged, each hand gripping an axe. With channeling the scythe through the links, Kallan whipped the elding chains and Durin dropped behind the lash. And fused with scythe, the metal whips lashed the air. Swinging the axes toward her feet, Durin lunged. Kallan leapt back, snapping her chains as scythe flowed from her palms down into the links. She grazed his back and Durin howled. Her final lash flogged his chest, and Durin fell. At the cave's end, the clear night sky beckoned her. A breeze blew and the Nordic wind swept her face as she stepped from the stifling hell of the caves. Hope engulfed her, easing every fire with the cold, sweet air and the fresh winds. But before she could feel soft grass beneath her bleeding, broken feet, the handle of an axe splintered the back of her head and sent pricks of light through her vision. Before Kallan hit the ground unconscious, she knew she was no longer in Alfheim.